Hello. All right. So in this video, we're going to be talking about some eukaryotic microbes. So remember that microbes take up the bacteria and the archaea. Those are going to be our prokaryotic microbes, but there are definitely some microbes in the eukarya domain of life. Actually, a majority of this tree, this part of the tree is still microbes. And so in this video, we're going to talk about two categories of eukaryotic microbes, the helminths and the protists. So let's start with the helminths. They are part of the Animalia tree of life. So they're actually here in the animals, which is crazy to think about. And there's a little bit of debate whether or not they're actually microbes since they are relatively large and honestly big enough to see with the naked eye. But because part of their life cycle is microscopic, they are still considered microbes in a sense. And so their life cycle includes the egg or cyst portion where they are just a tiny little speck. And so that's why they're microscopic. But then once they become adults, then they become macroscopic. So they become large. And so that's kind of why we still talk about them in microbiology. So many of these helminths are going to be parasitic. And there's really two main groups, phyla actually. Phyla is a category. There's two main phyla of helminths and the nematodes, which are going to be our roundworms. And that includes things like Ascaris and Trichinella. And then there's the platyhelminths, which are our flatworms. And those are going to include the flukes, which are like this. They're kind of just flat, single piece of a worm. And then let me dock here, the tapeworms, which are segmented and usually relatively long. And so what does segmented mean is when you look at it, there's literally a piece and then another piece attached to it. So they have segments to them. And so these are the helminths. And again, helminths are all worms, by the way. Hopefully you've noticed that they're either the roundworms or the flatworms. And a lot of them, again, parasitic. So you usually are exposed to them through food. Usually what happens is you accidentally consume the egg or cyst of one of these organisms that is found in meat or, anywhere. And then they will hatch in your digestive system. And that's how they infect. Then there are the protists and the protozoa. So let's kind of get some vocab out of the way here. Protist is actually an informal term, so it's not like a scientific part of the tree of life, but it is a term to describe the microscopic eukaryotes that are out there. And under them are the protozoa, also an informal term to describe specifically non-photosynthetic eukaryotes that are motile, meaning that they have some kind of swimming ability. So yeah, both of these words are, again, technically not part of the tree of life, so they're not like a formal term, but we use them all the time. So anyway, the protozoa specifically have what we call an outer cytoplasm and an inner cytoplasm. So we call the outer cytoplasm the ecto, and then the inner is the endocytoplasm. So here you can kind of see it. So here is a euglena, and it's got kind of like two layers, and in between the layers is the ectoplasm and then the endoplasm. So this one also has endoplasm and ectoplasm. So yeah, a lot of these protozoa also have what is called a contractile vacuole. So there's that. There's one there. There's one there. And that is going to help these organisms move water in and out because most of these organisms are going to be living in some kind of water situation, a lake, a river, a pond, something like that. And they have to balance their water to make sure they don't have too much water or too little water. And so the contractile vacuole kind of helps them maintain their water and salt balance. And most of these protozoa are going to be moving around. Remember that the protozoa are supposed to be motile, meaning they can swim. And so usually they're going to have either cilia, which are like these tiny hair-like structures that help them move around. They can have pseudopods, which are these like long, large extensions that stick out of them. Pseudo, by the way, means fake, and pod means foot. So it's kind of like a fake foot that sticks out. So they can use that to crawl around, or some of them have flagella to swim around. So those are their different, I guess, ways of moving around. And there are different types of protists, a lot of them. For example, we've got amoebas, which are weird looking guys. They usually move around using pseudopods. And then there's also the slime molds. Slime molds are weird because they like to grow in huge colonies together. And so you can actually find them. This is just a picture from a hike somewhere. Not me, but the textbook had this. And so as you can see, there's like twigs and grass. And so this thing is huge. Apicomplexans are a different type of protist. They are called that because they have an apical end. So they're kind of like, they have a head and a tail, not necessarily, but they have a front end and a back end. And the front end is called the apical end. And usually the apical end is how it burrows into its host if it's like some kind of parasitic protist. Then we have the ciliates. They're just named because they have tons of cilia. So if it is a protist that has tons of little hair-like structures like that, then that is called a ciliate. And then the excavatas also have very complex structures, but typically speaking, they're going to have a flagella for their movement. And they have very complicated life cycles. So we're not going to go over that in this video, but each protist and also going back to the helminths, they all have very, very complex life cycles. They have their egg or cyst form, and then they go into an organism and they do a bunch of stuff. They can reproduce, specifically for the protists, they can reproduce sexually or asexually. It's a whole mess. So we're not going to go into too much detail about that. And not only that, their phylogeny is very complicated. So the phylogeny is basically how they're categorized into their groups. And especially the protists, it's a big mess. There's protists that are over here, but then there's also protists that are down here, as you can see. And some of the protists might be part of the fungi, sort of, right? It's like a whole mess. And a lot of them move around. So we thought it was a fungi, and now it's not. So there's just a lot going on in terms of that. So that's my video on the helminths and the protists. Hopefully this was fun, and I'll see you in the next video.